Hey everyone, on today's episode, Callum and I are joined by Lawrence Harmon. I've been thinking quite a bit about how to introduce Lawrence because most people who have been around in the last decade know him. He's been involved with a lot of decks. He's probably most famously been involved with developing Top Barracudas and breaking it several times over. Ever since we've been delivered from Sensitive Running Top, thank you Wizards, Lawrence has made a name for himself as one of the leading diver strategy theorists of the last 5 years or so. So to sum it up, if a lot of the people that you see doing well in tournaments are James Bond, then Lawrence has been their cue, equipping them with all the technology one could ever need. A couple of years ago, he wrote one of the best, what I want to call meta-level ban articles that I've ever seen about Legacy, and this is something we want to discuss today. Today's episode is not about finding out whether Expressive Iteration, Days, or Murktide should be banned. We actually spent something like 5 minutes discussing that all together. Instead, we want to focus on the bigger picture, which is understanding why people want bans. A lot of times when I listen to or read about ban discussions, I feel like people are really talking past each other because while they have very legitimate arguments for why they want something banned or legal in the format, they are not operating on the same set of what they want out of the format, right? And I think these kinds of discussions are entirely pointless if you don't get to the deeper levels of understanding why somebody wants to play Legacy, why somebody is unhappy, what they expect out of the format. There are as many different measures to be taken by Wizards of the Coast as there are motivations to play the format. And if you want to take away something from today's episode, this is it. Nobody's right or wrong in what they want to have happen to Legacy, unless they want to unban Top, okay? Instead, it's all about whether the measures we propose line up with what we personally want out of the format. And in the end, it's up to Wizards to decide. It's up to Wizards to decide whether something like a Whac-A-Mole format is just going to be the future of Legacy, or whether we are actually going to take away some of what people would call the enablers and basically enter in one of the biggest new ages of Legacy that people could ever imagine. That's their thing. But don't ever feel bad about wanting one or the other. And that's what I want you to take away from today's episode. And of course, also just having an all-around great time hanging out with us. See you on the other side, and thanks for tuning into Everyday Eternal. Hello and welcome to Everyday Eternal number 121, your favorite, most deceptively named bi-weekly Legacy podcast. Today's show is brought to you by our brand new Patreon supporters Hamster, Troy Warrington, and Moonboating Bears. If you want to support the running of the show directly, you can support us on patreon.com/everydayeternal. Callum, do you know what moonboating means? Because I actually had to look that up.
No, I was about to say, we usually go into what I've been up to and stuff, and I was about to say, I don't know, I'm thinking about hamster and moonboating bears.
Well, apparently it means like planting your face in the ass cheeks of somebody and then blowing wind and like shaking your head, and it's supposed to make some... Yeah, I saw it in Urban Dictionary. I don't know if that's true. I hope I didn't offend moonboating bears, and maybe it means something very...
It's actually it's a family name, as you're being very offensive.
But yeah, that was quite something. So yeah, Moonboating Bears, Hamster, and Troy Warrington, welcome to the crew. Hope you already made your way into the Discord. If not, definitely do that. Sign up and let us know about the story of Moonboating Bears.
You'll fit right in. It's just, yeah.
Cool. Callum, you've been traveling again, right? You've been to Italy.
Yes.
Como?
Oh yeah, I'm now in like a state of why am I back in London? Everything's awful. I miss it. It was just a short trip, went last Friday because we had an Easter weekend. It was long and stuff. So visited some friends, like an hour outside Milan, near the Swiss border. So oh my god. So I went for a music show as well and to see some good friends. And then on Monday we went up to the top of a mountain and had barbecues, and the sun was blazing, loud music, and just absolute bliss. So now I'm all oh no, I have to come back and talk about Legacy. which is not too bad. Yeah. Oh my god, it was beautiful. So it's Italy, you're the best. What about you? Because otherwise, apart from that, I haven't been doing too much. Like that was my main thing leading up for a while, and then music stuff.
You know, I
What about
actually
you?
thought you might have been traveling to London for, like, I don't know, Easter festivities. I I wasn't quite sure, but yeah, I've been totally losing myself in Elden Ring, even though I put like almost 100 hours into it by now. But I'm still like in one of the first 2 or 3 areas because I'm like I don't know. I think overall I like Dark Souls and everything a little bit better, but Elden Ring is certainly something I can like put like a 6-hour shift into it without even noticing it.
I still keep getting tempted to get that. I'm not really much of a video gamer at all, and I get bored of games after an hour of playing them. But so many of my friends are talking about it, how it's just one of the best games ever, and it keeps getting tempting. So you saying it's good is tempting as well. We'll see.
You know, one day we're gonna have a show about like what you actually like. You don't like video games. You don't like food. Come on, man.
Okay, I had some incredible food in Italy, just like pizza and pasta and stuff. But it's just
Oh, you
made
just put
so
the
well.
biggest smile on Andrea's face.
It was just delicious.
But yeah, I'm super hyped for Monkey Island. If you don't know Monkey Island, that's a series that was created by Ron Gilbert over 30 years ago. Like the last Monkey Island game that Ron Gilbert made was 31 years ago. I still can't believe it that we're actually getting a sequel. We actually had sequels produced by other people. And yeah, if you're a point and click fan, and I so much am, I'm super, like I literally couldn't believe it. And the best part is, he actually announced it on April 1st, and the guy is very much known for hating April 1st and not wanting to make April 1st jokes. And he literally announced it on April 1st, and nobody believed him. And like a week later, he came forward and he was like, "No, seriously, guys, this is real."
I'm a real big fan of the reverse April Fools. It's just great because it really confuses people. They're like, "Would they do this? Wouldn't they do this?" There was a huge announcement in Warhammer on April 1st, and like the whole community was split, like with no idea what to do, what to believe. So, well played.
Cool. So, and speaking of announcement and everything, this could have been just another Legacy episode, Legacy podcast episode of talking about, hey, should we ban Murktide? Should we ban Days, Wasteland, what have you? Rich Kelly actually released a great article about that on Channel Fireball. We are not really doing that today because maybe I'm misjudging and people want to constantly talk about bans all the time, but that's really not us, unless there's like a pressing issue. I guess to a certain degree there is. But what we want to do is we want to talk about bannings in the context of something like format identity, something on a more, well, I guess it sounds sophisticated when I say on a more meta level about what actually makes it so that a ban is quote unquote justified. Because I see people talk about bannings all the time and they keep talking past each other because they have like very different basic how do you call it, axioms about like what a format is supposed to be. And I think especially in Legacy, over the last almost 10 years, I want to say, we've been kind of lacking this general idea of what the format is actually supposed to be. So I felt like, especially over the last couple of years, people have been like quite unhappy on both sides of bans or no bans. And whom better to invite than the guy who actually wrote, well, I don't want to say the Bible. I guess that's going a little bit too far on Legacy bannings. But we're going to have Lawrence Harmon on the cast tonight. And Lawrence, you wrote a great article about legacy bans and mindsets. It's actually 2 years ago on Channel Fireball. I pulled it up again when I was researching this episode. And we really want to hear from you about what you feel Legacy is supposed to do, where we are, and yeah, which kind of food Callum should try when he goes to the US for the first time in a month.
The main course there.
Yeah, Callum, just hit me up with a list of cities and I can either find out who I know in those areas and like what they recommend.
Will do.
Yeah,
all right, that's the main part of the podcast done. Let's
Exactly.
dive into the side.
Everyday eat turn. Here we go. No, seriously, Lawrence, how's it going, man?
It's going all right. Just been kind of chilling, working, writing more Magic articles, which I wasn't planning on doing this year, but I keep like writing one and then having an idea for another one. I'm like, that could be fun to explore. So we'll see what else comes out of the pipeline. I have a few that I'm pseudo working on right now.
Yeah, you already sent us a preview. I think by now it's already out on Channel Fireball as well, where people can find all your work. Have you been able to play a lot lately, or how's your relationship with Magic or Legacy in particular right now?
I haven't really been playing a lot. I just kind of like keep up to date on the happenings of the formats, but I haven't been like keeping up with every card that gets released and all of that. Legacy is pretty easy to pay attention to in like a passive sense because the format doesn't change much and its changes are fairly predictable based on trends, you know? It's like, oh, you know, you have like the cycle of control deck inbreeding where people will start with like a blue-white deck that's really good against greedy mana bases, and then they'll try and win the mirror, so they'll become blue-white-red or whatever. And then eventually those decks just slowly converge into being 4-color piles, and then you circle back to people going like, hey, Back to Basics is a sweet card. Let's just do that to everybody. And then like Delver decks will go from like blue-red to, if there's a pool, to Grixis, they'll usually do that, but often Rug Delver decks will come up to trump the blue-red mirror because historically Tarmogoyf is like the mirror breaker there. And then, you know, again, it'll just go through its cycle of kind of vacillating between 2-color and 3-color Delver decks being the best thing to do.
I think that would actually be a really good statement for the maybe title of the episode. Legacy is actually pretty easy. It's like gonna get people to click. You know, you get the people who actually wanna understand Legacy, and you get the people who are like very uptight and they're like, no, Legacy is not very easy. It's very hard. Oh, I'm gonna show them. I'm gonna listen to their podcast. I'm like, okay, thank you for the click.
Oh yeah, like casting Brainstorm now is significantly easier than it was a decade ago because like partially just the construction of decks. You know, when you think about like Shardless Bug compared to something like Checkpile, because Shardless Bug didn't have any deck manipulation outside of Brainstorm, there's a lot of pressure on the card to be good. And then you also have to juggle the whole Ancestral Visions shenanigans. So like your Brainstorms are really stressed, but now everybody just has like Ponders and Preordains. So it's much easier to navigate your deck and you just have to cast Brainstorm less until it actually matters. So I've always found that interesting.
And the more powerful cards get, the better the cantrips are, and the easier it is. You just like play it, find what you need, and you have now so many different removal spells. You're like, okay, well I need like a Prismatic Ending or a Source Plowshares. Doop doop doo, I got it, and you carry on.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. So we already mentioned this. What we want to understand today is the discussion that's going on in Legacy right now, and I mean everybody's aware of like which cards are currently in contention, but overall it's especially the Delver Shell as a whole. And while we don't want to go into detail about which card you think should be banned, we want to understand the general meta level of what's going on, right? And you recently wrote an article, I think it was in February, titled EDH and the Issues Inherent to Eternal Formats. And I think you summed up the issue with bannings as follows. I don't think so. I actually have it quoted here in my show notes. I'm not that smart. I remember everything from memory. So summarizing, bannings have historically led to an array of community discontent. Players who felt the card was fine will be frustrated because they'll see the ban as unwarranted format micromanagement. Inversely, others will be frustrated about the card not being axed sooner, assuming apathy and aloofness of those in power. Additionally, there's a more generalized demographic that sees ownership of cards as an investment and will be frustrated at the monetary loss due to the ban. I think today we are not going to talk as much about the third group of people who feel like, oh, I'm losing money. I think that's more like a function of something like, you know, reserved list, card accessibility and everything. That's probably more like a topic for an entire own episode or two.
Yeah, I think that kind of just comes down to whether or not you think Wizards cares about like the secondary market, and I just don't have any commentary on that. I just don't care at all.
I think
whether or not they
especially
do.
like when once you explore this territory, you also quickly get into like conspiracy theories about, oh, Wizards wants to kill Legacy because it's gonna benefit, I don't know, some other format, and I have a hard time being on board with that. I have yet to be like really convinced of seeing something like that.
No, I just think that like Eternal formats get way too big to micromanage, and I don't think Wizards necessarily cares to try and kill a format outside of like Extended, where
that one was like straight up killed.
Yeah, they straight up killed
they...
Extended because they just were probably losing money having events for that format. But with Eternal formats like Legacy and Vintage, the communities have pretty much taken over having stuff happen, so it's fine. It's all gonna just keep going. But Extended, I think, was pretty much just pretty ubiquitously seen as just a tournament format by most players.
Yeah, Extended was like kind of weird because it was like one of the most popular formats in Magic, and then they made like so many changes over the course of a very short time frame, and it's like it couldn't manage it, right? It just died, and they kind of removed it from competitive play, but they still dragged the corpse around for like a year or two. Like they still had like queues on Magic Online. Technically, it was still a supported format, and eventually we just got Modern, which is, well, I don't want to call it the fixed version of Extended, but yeah, that's that's its own. Like Modern has its own issues these days, but I hear it's like decent.
I think Extended's interesting. For those who don't know, Extended was basically just super standard. It was like what, the last 6 sets or something, 4 to 6 sets, something like that.
Yeah, it was rotating, but with a much larger pool, right?
Yeah. They changed, like later on they changed it to basically be standard of something like 3 or 4 years, and previously I think it was more like 5 or 6 years. I'm totally pulling those numbers out of my ass, but yeah, it was much slower rotating standard.
Yeah, and you get like the interesting juxtaposition of having a small enough environment that like when cards are designed, they're metagamed for standard, right? Or balanced for standard. And when you start breaking out of standard, you start to see wonky card interactions. So Extended is interesting in that the power level was just pretty variable from one cycle to the next, right? If I remember correctly.
Yeah, we had like Tinkerjar, Megrim at some point, and then you have, I don't know, like
Dark
kind
Depths, Thopter combo.
Yeah, exactly. And then sometimes you have Exalted Angel playing a pretty fair game and stuff. It was very disparative.
Or you just have like Goblins, I think was a deck for a while.
Yeah, Goblin Bidding, hell yeah.
Yeah, so
basically had like three eras. Like the very first one was what people called Old Extended. That was like the one that everybody remembers when they talk about Extended. It's one of their favorite formats. It was like kind of broken, like actually quite broken to a certain degree. Similarly to earlier Legacy. Then we had that second phase where all the broken stuff was gone, but you could still like play kind of like a mid-range game. And then the dying phase when they switched their rotation to, I don't even know, but everybody like dropped out in the third phase, and that's why the format pretty much just like died as soon as Wizards made that change. So yeah, there's usually people either have great memories of Extended or no memories of Extended. There's not much in between. How do you stop Legacy from turning into a next Extended? what are we supposed to do? Like, how do we understand what's going on in Legacy? In our show notes, we described this as the idea of a format identity, because that's something, especially for the first, I want to say like 10 years of Legacy's existence, nobody has ever really questioned because it just came to us naturally. For example, to describe it from my side, I came into Legacy in 2006, 2007, and back then Legacy was supposed to be the creature format, which I guess surprises a lot of people these days. But back then, like, we had a lot of broken stuff in Standard, we had a lot of broken stuff in Extended, and Legacy was supposed to be the format where you go and you just play Legacy, you just play Magic, you just play creatures, you tap them, you have some control decks, you have some wonky combo decks that weren't really all that great, and you could just like, cast your creatures, turn them sideways and attack. And that's pretty far from what Legacy these days stands for, I think. You still play creature decks in Legacy, but I feel like it's the identity has changed quite a bit, and with that, the expectation that players coming into the format have towards what they want to experience, and in the long run, what Wizards has to cater for, right? Like, how do they have to manage the ban list to accomplish that?
Yeah, Legacy has its identity, but it's not as concrete as something like Modern, where people see it as the turn 4 format, or if people still hold up to that arbitrary line of brokenness. But at least with Modern, there was the standard set of, combo decks that win before a certain point can't exist, or ones that are too oppressive can't exist, because I want to say a disproportionate amount of the Modern ban list is essentially just combo pieces. But with Legacy, essentially Legacy's identity was just being not vintage, and because it was a relatively new format, you could kind of go in and just let the landscape evolve naturally and see what happens, which is fine in the short term, but in the long term, things get out of control. And I think that's just something that's going to happen with eternal formats. I don't think you can necessarily keep a complete grip on them or completely manage their power level just due to random card interactions, but also because of player expectation, right? A lot of debates about bannings or restrictings in Legacy or Vintage often center around, should we ban this card that a lot of people like, or do we let people keep playing their Delvers, their Workshop decks, their Bazaar decks, or whatever, these, long-standing oppressive archetypes? Like, Bazaar and Workshop have been pretty much the best thing to do in Vintage for
forever.
Forever, right?
Yeah.
It's like the format
It's
balanced around...
It's accepted brokenness. Players find it fun even if it's not fair.
I mean, there's accepted brokenness, but the format also has its own sense of balance, and so far as like Black Lotus is restricted, Moxen are restricted. You have these lines of like, here's how much fast mana we're letting people play with, except for Bazaar and Workshop, which just completely like level that rule. Bazaar, obviously, those decks just Workshop decks essentially get to play 5 Black Lotuses with the drawback of playing good cards. And Bazaar decks, how much mana Bazaar quote-unquote produces varies, right? You could tap it and then you could have a complete board state, or you could just do nothing. And I guess that's... the randomness is a bit of a balancing dynamic, but the way those decks have been constructed for years has often rewarded just mulliganing to Bazaar. So...
as was intended.
Isn't holding, yeah.
Yeah.
So what you're basically saying is that comparing it to Vintage, that these enablers in the sense of like Bazaar and Workshop have existed basically since the beginning, and ever since then it's been slowly being filled up with like broken stuff. Because I remember when I first heard about Bazaar, I also thought, oh my god, this is the craziest thing ever. And then like the more seasoned, I guess, Vintage players explained to me, yeah, but like what do we do? Like we cast, I don't know, Sword of Fire and Ice and put it on Triskelion. And that's a lot less exciting of what people do with it these days. So it feels like, as comparing it to Legacy, in Legacy we also have this thing where the I want to call them pillar enablers have existed for quite a while. Something like, I don't know, Dark Ritual, Show and Tell, Wasteland Days. But we didn't always have the payoff in, like Grizzlebrand, Delver of Secrets, what have you, all the stuff that's being played in Storm these days. So I can see a parallel to that. And I guess that's creating a lot of friction with regards to like what should we ban. Like one of the most famous bans, of course, being Survival of the Fittest, because I think that's one of the first instances, or maybe even like, guys, help me out. Is this the only instance in Legacy where Wizards ended up banning the established enabler as opposed to the new broken card?
Does Mystical Tutor count? I would say it does, in terms of getting that Reanimator build out of the format.
Yeah, Mystical Tutor is another good example of that. That card was also like kind of broken.
I can't remember, was Flash legal in Legacy? I think Flash was that, like GP Columbus, I think that was Legacy, but I can't quite
Protein
remember.
Hulk
That was like 2007, I believe.
Yeah, Protein Hulk Flash, that combo deck.
And somehow Goblins was in the final.
That was interesting. In this, yeah. It's like, what are we going to do in the most broken Legacy format ever? I'm going to play Goblin Lackey and Goblin Matron. Yeah, Flash is like interesting because it was kind of like a new printing because it received that power level errata that completely changed to me, Flash was like a new printing at that point because it worked so differently. But Mystical Tutor is a good example as well.
Yes, there's not many examples though. You're right.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, one of the ones I remember is from Modern when they banned Birthing Pod, under the logic that, the card just allowing these decks to just be a bunch of one of silver bullets and being consistently able to find them, or find Pod and then enable it or function without it, was a bit too much. And near the end of that deck's life, people weren't even trying to like use Pod as a combo enabler. It was just like, I'm playing Siege Rhino Abzan and I just have a bunch of fun ofs that just destroy whatever deck I'm playing against. And when you have like the Dark Confidant effect, but it's just Demonic Tutor, that's a bit much. And the ability to just break any creature that gets printed was a concern, so they nuked the card.
I do remember them saying in the article, like, we're doing it in foresight of more broken creatures getting printed.
Like, who would have known?
Yeah.
It's like, we said, okay, we're going to limit ourselves to unbroken creatures for the rest of our existence.
Just to keep Bullwinkle alive, but alas.
Yeah, we're gonna rename the game Birthing Pot the Gathering or something. But yeah, I loved Pot. But to tie this back to the idea of the format identity, in one of your articles, you actually summed up what Legacy's format identity is or has kind of like been in the past. Like usually like one of the more common answers people give when you ask them, hey, what does Legacy mean to you? One of them is like the slow changing nature of Legacy. And I always say like this is such a big upside because you have a lot of people. But I was going to say with more money, but usually it's more like people who are like not in, I don't know, college anymore. People who like have work, have families who don't get to stay on the pulse of the metagame like, you know, the Zoomers, the grinders do. So you can just like walk away from the format for half a year, come back, and still feel like, hey, you're kind of understanding what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, if you leave Legacy and come back, it's like, okay, so this is the blue control deck, this is the build of Delver. You already have an idea of how these decks function, and like, people will just change a few cards. On the notes here, you have the whole play what you want dynamic, and I think what's interesting to me is at least recent card design has been so powerful that aspect of Legacy has been kind of dying off. Whereas, like, even during the Deathrite Shaman days, the way the metagame broke down, you still had some leeway to just play piles, essentially, or just, like, whatever dorky idea you had. And I definitely capitalized on that. But now, like, the tools that these decks are so powerful, and the cards that are being printed are so absurdly above rate that there's, like, this dynamic of forced obsolescence happening. So, like, before, you could get away with, like, playing some Nick Fit, or you could justify it, but now, because the Delver decks are, like, so good, or what have you, you're just gonna get destroyed if you try to play something that isn't fighting on their level, right? There isn't a tier 3, essentially. It's just tier 0, tier 1, tier 2, and then everything past that is largely not gonna keep up in the arms race.
I was gonna say, I've definitely felt this effect as well. Like, I've always enjoyed playing kind of weird piles and stuff back in the day, like when I got into Legacy, and it was definitely one of the selling points when I got into the format by the people around me who were saying, yeah, you can play what you want. I remember borrowing like, well, Nick Fit and the Gate and stuff like that when I was getting into it.
The Gate.
Yeah, and I was like recurring nightmaring kitchen things and stuff, and like it was just very fair. But then as I learned the format more, I was like, wow, these decks are pretty bad. But you know, you can always beat the tier 1 decks by like just having a bit of draw or playing a bit tighter and stuff. And
yeah.
It definitely was a selling point that I was told, because I'm quite interested in how people are sold in the format. Like, after I finish this, you guys tell me what like you were told the Legacy's format identity is by people when you got into it, because we've written here slow changing. I was definitely told that, like, yeah, you can step away and come back. I feel like it's still true to an extent. Like, there's a lot of new cards coming into the format, but you still have your Delver deck, you still have your blue control decks, you still have, like, you know,
your Storm decks.
Your Storm decks,
Show and
exactly.
Tell hasn't, like, even when Show and Tell goes through major changes, it's like,
yeah,
all right, so Dig Through Time or adding Veil of Summer, but the way the deck functions on its like core level is the same.
Exactly. And I think I hear a lot of like gnashing of teeth and stuff on this axis, where they're like saying, oh, but they've got all these new cards, you need to learn all these new cards. But I mean, Murktide is just still a big dumb beater, and you had Tarmogoyf years ago. Like, it's the same axis that you can learn from. So I think that's still similar. The lower financial and strategic maintenance in the long run, this has changed more, but I still think it's, you know, there's the similar pillars, like the slow changing aspect. You do need to know of new archetypes cropping up, and I find like the Delver decks, because, well, as the format plays more cantrips, basically they're going to find they're harder to hit like sideboard cards more often. So you do often need to know what kind of sideboard cards the fair decks are playing if you're playing a combo deck, or vice versa. So I do think you need to, if you want to be playing at a high level in Legacy, you do need to be keeping up more than you used to. And then I think I completely agree with what you said about play what you want. It's just getting tougher and tougher.
Yeah, that's the part where I wanna basically connect it to what we previously said about pillars, or rather enablers, kind of vanishing either through bans, or in the case of like all these like what we just call tier 3 decks, them just not being good enough anymore. Like in the past, even if you played a tier 3 deck, you like Callum said, right? You still felt like you're putting up a fight, even if your deck like was disadvantaged against most of the best decks in the format. I think that's a major thing that has somewhat shifted, that is making people unhappy and frustrated, that they feel like they're let's say Veteran Explorer as a potential enabler. I mean, yeah, I'm gonna categorize it as that, is not good enough anymore. And that can be very, very frustrating when one of the core tenets of the format for like over a decade used to be, hey, your deck might not be the best, but play what you want, play it well, and maybe you're gonna top 8 the next whatever event. And I think people are really feeling like this is running through their hands, and it's not being a thing anymore. And it almost like creates fear of like, I don't want to call it FOMO, because you're not missing out on something. It's just like gone forever when you feel like it shouldn't be.
If someone's a deck specialist and the deck is dropping off faster and faster, they're losing relevancy, right? They're thinking, am I relevant in this format that's going too fast for me?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of success in Legacy is like, for the last decade, if you wanted to do well in Legacy, you just learn of 2 archetypes out of either Delver, Blue Control, some sort of Lotus Petal combo deck, whether that's Show and Tell or Storm, it doesn't matter. And then I guess Death and Taxes is kind of always just good enough in Legacy to survive. And if you can just pivot between one of those archetypes, depending on metagame trends, you're fine. But that's only for the people who really want to stay competitively relevant, right? And for everyone else, they have to deal with the fact that these other decks have just been getting disproportionately stronger. I think we started to see the whole forced obsolescence dynamic pop up with Top Miracles. Because that deck was just too good and kind of killed people's ability to play a lot of the wonkier decks in the format. But the flip side of that is that I felt, because of how stable Top Miracles was and how it dictated what could be played, at least at the top tables, you had a lot of room to screw around with different like tier 2-ish strategies, and you could just do fun, goofy stuff.
Because you expected Miracles to show up, so you'd be like over prepared. For example, like I think you mentioned Rodrigo Togoro's deck for GP Prague in 2016, right? When basically his entire sideboard was anti-Miracles.
Yeah, I believe it was like 7 out of Crows and Grips and Abrupt Decays, Flusterstorms.
Like... Yeah, and 2 more copies of Tendrils of Agony and everything.
Yeah.
I was like, I mean, that's what you had to do, right?
Yeah.
Yeah, what I mean is, like, for a given tournament's metagame, you could expect Miracles, Shardless, maybe a bit of Stoneblade, some Death and Taxes, and then Grixis Delver. And these decks were just the top echelon of the format and were kind of untouchable in that regard. But because those decks were so consumed with beating each other, any other deck they beat was mostly just by nature of those shells being really powerful in their own right. But because their construction didn't change, the effect they had on the format wasn't variable. Insofar as, like, there wasn't a dynamic where 1 week you could play Merfolk and then the next week you couldn't. There was just like this very static metagame that you could figure out. And because it was that static, you could build off-the-wall decks and you were fine as long as you had, if you were playing Nick Fit and you had your plan to beat the Delver deck semi-consistently, you were fine. You probably weren't beating Miracles consistently. That matchup was pretty abysmal for Nick Fit.
That was like the old, your cable therapy meme. Okay, let me brainstorm Chase to the top or something. And just cast Chase and it's over.
The dynamic of like they just couldn't sack Veteran Explorer. That was just the strategy. You just had to board that card out because like the Veteran Explorer ramping your opponent into Jace was pretty brutal. I think the only Nick Fit build that I saw that really straight up didn't care about that was the Scapeshift like sneak attack version. Burning Wish Skip.
Okay. That one was pretty legit. I thought it was good.
Wasn't
yeah,
really?
I got Shame boiled by that deck at one point.
Yeah. And then we had stuff like, what's it called? Silver and Plug, like the main deck for chokes and everything. Yeah, that's something people pulled off back then, but these days, man, it's so hard, seriously.
Yeah, like, I mean, I was just thinking about this the other day. Like, part of the dominance of Miracles was that, and Delver in a sense, were that the decks that beat them are kind of just unplayable in a broad sense. Like Goblins could beat Miracles back in the day, but it just didn't stand up as well against the rest of the format. So part of the reason that these decks become the best deck in the format isn't because they aren't infallible. It's just because their natural predators are so weak to everything else.
You know, that's a really good point, because I remember so many times during the Top Miracles era, people were like, hey, the answers are there. We don't need to ban anything. And my response to that has always been, yes, the answers are there, but it's not worth dedicating so much to beating this one deck. So you rather, run a broader approach.
Yeah, I think that conversation kind of goes into the conversation of like, what is an acceptable number of sideboard cards in a philosophical standpoint? Like, what's the max number of sideboard cards players should have to devote to beating the best deck, right? Like, is playing... And how dedicated, I guess. Like, right now people play 4 Red Blast for Blue Mirrors, and that's just kind of seen as fine, because Red Blast is flexible, it's good against enough decks. But, like, the Tagoras thing, where the Storm deck sideboard was, like, quad Abrupt Decay, 2 Krosan Grip or something, or the inverse of that, plus a Bayou, plus, like, maybe other cards on top of that. And, or, Vintage Dredge during the days where people would have to pack 8+ sideboard cards. And I think once you get to that point, you're starting to see too much dominance if you need that many tools to combat a deck. With Top Miracles, it was interesting because when you looked at the way people built their decks, and I'm seeing this a lot now with Delver, you can tell they have the deck in mind, but they aren't dedicating a lot of cards to it in terms of, like, really dedicated cards. When Top Miracles was a thing, you might see a Null Rod, you might see a random Pithing Needle in someone's sideboard for top, but you didn't see really aggressive hate, which is, a bit of a misnomer, because how do you combat a variable control deck like Miracles? And the same dynamic is happening with Delver, in that Delver's basically just a mid-range deck, and combating mid-range decks is usually a dynamic of, like, going under them, going over them, or out-carding them. And I actually have an article that I kind of started with this, or at least a draft of something. So I guess this is a preview. But essentially, like, Delver is the most aggressive deck in
on
Legacy.
Everyday Chana.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, like, Delver is the most aggressive deck in Legacy, sans, like, Burn, and I guess you could argue Elves could be, like, considered a classically aggressive deck. But other than that, there aren't decks that are going under Delver, and Wasteland prevents decks from going over Delver. So you have, like, a mid-range deck that forces people to fight exactly on the axis that a mid-range deck wants to fight on.
In addition to, I would add, like, the hardest thing about fighting Delver is they adapt to whatever you're fighting with so easily. They add, like, 2 cards to their sideboard, and they're gonna hate your hate pretty fast.
Oh, yeah. Exactly. And that's the thing. Like, mid-range decks, in the article I'll probably go more in depth and, like, explain this a bit better, but because they're so variable, you're like attacking an idea, right? And when you think about
beating, rise like, up, attack the idea.
Like, when you think of, even Charlotte's Bug or Modern Jund or Check Pile, when you're beating those decks, it's not really a matter of beating them on card quality, because all of their cards are pretty unilateral in what they do. It's usually some sort of impedance effect for the opponent, or something that can punch them in the face, or just a card draw engine. And, like, a 1-to-1, analysis, it's hard to just beat that as, I'm trying to, like, coagulate this idea.
So what I call these decks usually when I don't really know how to properly address them or tackle them, even if I wanted. I usually call those decks, like, slippery in a strategic sense. It's not like I'm gonna beat you, because it's not something you can't, like, wake up tomorrow and decide, hey, I'm gonna beat Delver, unless you play, like, a horribly misconstructed deck.
Midrange is just a vague term because the decks pivot from, like, being aggressive to being control. So, like, when you think of combating Storm or, like, Burn, right, you can immediately think of cards that are good against those decks, that fundamentally, like, invalidate the strategy. Something like a Kitchen Finks or a Life Gain spell. Something like City of Solitude or Flusterstorm, right? When you think of a mid-range deck and you're like, how do I beat this strategy? You're just like, okay, I either need something like a Blood Boon that's just going to be this random hoser that might meme them out of the game, or I need to beat them at what they're doing, or, again, going under them if you can find something aggressive enough. In Modern, usually people have been able to capitalize on how painful those mana bases are, so the like aggressive red shells in decks like Affinity just constantly get to exist. In Legacy, there isn't really an allegory for that, and then the big mana decks fluctuate in viability. Whether or not you want to count lands as big mana is up to you, but like something like Eldrazi or 12 Post are weak to Wasteland. Eldrazi was really weak to Daze, and it like you just kind of like can't think of a singular effect that would attack the concept of mid-range, and that's the struggle. And with Legacy, because of how Brainstorm works and your access to cantrips and just having these very powerful, cheap tools, the mid-range decks can pivot against you, like Callum said, as fast, if not faster, than you can metagame for them. So they're just amorphous blobs that you can't really combat on a deck-building level. And Legacy players tend to be less willing to play really dedicated hate cards. I mentioned people just kind of ubiquitously playing Red Blast, but that card isn't good against Delver. It hasn't been good against Delver since like Treasure Cruise, you know?
I remember when people played like 7 or 8 copies of Red Blast during the Treasure Cruise metagame.
Oh yeah. That meta game was...
Yeah, I like the amorphous blob name. Like that fits it perfectly. It's just so hard to get a grip on. I think the best card people have found in the last couple of years against Delver has been Carpet of Flowers, probably. But
yeah,
it requires like serious deck building constructions from you. First of all, playing green is never free.
Because you're splashing a 4th color to make your mana better against the Wasteland deck, right?
I saw so many decks or games where someone's like, not a fully Euro deck, so they are splashing green, and they're like, okay, so do I fetch this trop turn 1 to play it and hope I don't get dazed? If I get dazed, then Wastelanded, I'm just completely dead, or to like fetch a basic. And what I'm saying is it has real deck building constrictions, and that's been probably like fairly agreed to be one of the best sideboard cards against Delver. So if that's the cost of doing it, other than that, like, yeah, Blast is good right now just because Murktide is such a huge problem. But if Murktide isn't there, Delver's still going to be very good. Like, there's a lot of people saying, yeah, well, of course, after Ragavan, Delver's still good. But everyone knew that, but it was like, a test. And I think after Murktide is gone, Delver's still going to be good. But
yeah, Explosive Iteration needed to be the card. Well, so I think Ragavan would have gotten banned anyway. Where mid-range decks tend to get, like, really broken is when they have access to either, like, a really broken card advantage engine or just access to mana ramp in a way that fits into their deck. So like Deathrite Shaman provided modern and legacy mid-range decks with the ability to just accelerate their curve, and mid-range decks are often like, they want a double spell. You want to get to this point in the game where you're just constantly playing 2 spells a turn, and that's part of why like Dark Confidant or Treasure Cruise obviously is so good.
Mm-hmm.
And these decks being able to go from like turn 1, Deathrite Shaman to turn 2, Thoughtseize Goyf or Thoughtseize Bob or Liliana or
the dream was
Young Pyromancer Ponder, whatever, right?
The dream was Young Pyromancer Probe U Therapy.
Oh god, dude, I hate it. Dude, I literally wanted to rage quit games when that happened.
And like the thing is, it doesn't really matter what the 2 cards are, because like all of your cards are just built to be good against people, as opposed like they don't play into a coherent progressive or proactive game plan. They are built like your deck is built around negative interaction. So as long as you're casting spells and casting them at a higher velocity than your opponent, you're probably just winning. And that's just kind of the mid-range debacle. It's hard to just combat mid-range decks unless you, one, take away their mana advantage in the form of like Deathrite getting banned, or in Legacy, the card advantage engines, like Treasure Cruise, Dig Through Time. Delver played Dig Through Time, which, like, that deck's mana did not look like it could really support it that well, but it did.
It totally did. Alongside Goyf as well. Like, it was fine. Yeah. I mean, I think this also ties into what you just said, how, like, so Delver wants to double spell. Totally true. And the way they get card advantage historically has always been that the fact that their spells are cheapest, they operate off 2 or 3 lands as well. And when you add that on top of, like, having these draw 2s, or, like, Expressive Iteration is great card filtering and advantage, and it does all the things. Yeah. So you're just... The problem, the way you'd fight like a player double spelling each turn is eventually they'll run out of cards. But when you can tread this line between. Actually, there was a great article by Isaac Bullwinkle recently where
I was gonna bring that up. Like I was thinking about the very
I took
same
your
thing.
thunder.
Yeah, go
I
ahead.
actually I know about that, but I didn't read it. When I started writing for CFB, I stopped reading a lot of Magic stuff, especially things related to stuff that I might be working on.
I think it's an idea that's been around for a long time, but people have never like conceptualized and showed people as much. Where it's like Delver as the mid-range deck. So basically, he's cut Delver. He's playing two predicts, and he's playing like Cyber Counterballs. He is the mid-range deck, as you've been describing. So rather than having this aggressive axis, he's just doubling down on being more aggressive.
So cutting Delver from Delver is something that's happened a lot over the years, right? There's been like the Jonathan Alexander Threshless, Pokemoki pile. Every time Delver gets good, someone's like, I know how to make Delver better, we'll cut Delver. A lot of the times they're wrong. Isaac's list looks good. I haven't read his logic. I'll probably read it soon-ish. Like the list looks fine. The thing that about Delver for me is because you have all these free spells, you're a mid-range deck that can double spell from turn 1, which is pretty unique in Delver's favor. And then you have this added layer of, like, when you add Ren and 6, Treasure Cruise, Explosive Iteration, Dark Confidant, any sort of, like, card advantage engine, you start getting to the point where you can triple spell, essentially, at any point in the game. So you just, like, beat people on velocity pretty consistently, and then often, because, like, Legacy is a format, the cards converge on this axis of, like, wanting to be as cheap as possible while being as potent as possible, and the Delver deck is probably the most refined shell at doing exactly that. So like you triple spelling is just better, or even double spelling, or Delver plus Daze on anything is just going to be backbreaking, before you factor in the fact like Daze being a time walk and all that.
Yeah, it's even like the way Delver's built and made. This is, as you said, it's happened in the past where Delver players cut Delver and then the world moves on, and like again it's happening now. And I personally find these builds a lot easier to target, but they are very good for a certain amount of time, and then people are realizing that actually you do need to have these like fast clocks to kill people sometimes, or like the bigger decks can just go over this style. I think
like the reason the Delver decks are good is because they can play the control game, but they can also just beat your opponent to death pretty quickly.
I've died turn 3 to some Delver decks. It's like, where did that come from?
Like, Tan and Grace likes to quote Mike Tyson. Everybody has a plan until they get punched in the face. And he's just like, yeah, that's why Delver is good.
I love
because,
that.
Like, with Miracles, you could... I guess in pre-Monastery Mentors printing, with Miracles, you could lose to a lot of random stuff. Just people understanding how to capitalize on, like, getting under Entreat or invalidating Jace or whatever. But once you got the ability to, like, pivot into, like, more aggression, the 12-post matchup or Mud stopped really being as scary. And you didn't need to try and devote random cards to your bad matchups. It was just like, we're going to play Mentor. And that's the power of Delver. It's people have to respect your aggressive plan, but they also have to respect that you can just play the long game as well. And yeah,
I'm fully with you here. This is what I find what's like the hardest thing to play against this deck, and has been forever. Is like you have an opening hand of like, okay, well I've got one removal spell and like 2 card advantage spells going to go, and they go like turn 1 Delver, turn 2 Delver, and you're like, whoa, shit, buddy.
Yeah, you keep the hand that's like, all right, I have a Red Blast for whatever their Murktide.
Yeah,
I have a Flusterstorm for their Explosive Iteration, or back in the day you might have something to answer. Like against Grixis Delver, you might board in answers for sideboard Liliana or what have you, and you have a hand that's good against the control half of their deck, and then you just get destroyed by the Delver Deathrite draw. Or you might have something that's good against the creature half, and then your opponent just like plays 3 land drops, plays Liliana, the Last Hope, and just protects it for however many turns.
That's pretty much what Bullwinkle is also saying in the article. He mostly frames it in the context of how to play the blue-red Delver Mirror, where you can't really like say, oh, is this the perfect way to go? Should I completely sideboard and prepare for the tempo aggressive way, or should I prepare more for like the control-ish version? And how that is like allowing people to distinguish themselves by understanding that better than others. To tie this back to the idea of what's going wrong in the format right now, I think we did a pretty good job outlining why Delver, for pretty much the entire existence of Legacy, like the first European Legacy GP in 2005 was won by, well, we call it Delver, I guess we call it, what would we call it back then? Threshold, I guess, is what we called it. And that has basically, since the inception of the format, been one of the best things to do. I think you also ran the numbers, Lawrence, back to 2012, where you also showed that there was basically one of, usually like the best performing deck or one of the best performing decks.
Oh, yeah. I just like used MTG Top 8's like aggregate data to just roughly see what the best archetypes were amongst the most aggressive shell, the most controlling shell, and then like the combo decks. And like Sneak and Show was the most played combo deck consistently, which is interesting to me because I probably just have more recency bias with
the world's got to have their
Storm being
Jerry's. The world's got its Jerry's.
Yeah, it is the hardest part of the deck.
Oh yeah.
But then, you know, Delver just was the best, you know, aggressive-ish shell for 10 years, and
the fact that
it's
Delver
just
hasn't
gonna keep
been
being so.
played more, because I think a lot of people have known that for basically most of its existence. Like,
Well,
it's
it's the play what you want thing.
exactly,
right?
exactly. Is the point I was going to make. Is like, you know, if Legacy was a much more competitive format, we would, I think, just see so much more Delver. We'd see people trying to fight it for a bit and then giving up and just joining, and like, so this is the joy of Delver. I mean, Legacy. It's basically the same thing. This is the joy of it as well, where people will play it and other things enough that, you know, this is almost like a gentleman's agreement, like when Mystical Tutor was legal. Like, you know what? We all know that Delver's the best thing, but we all enjoy these other things, so let's keep enjoying it. And so far, we haven't had enough like top tier events to go otherwise.
Yeah, I actually have two interesting things to say about that. The second one actually ties into what you just mentioned about or rather like previously in the, well, I guess dark days of Legacy, whatever you want to call it. Some people call it the golden age. we didn't really have these smaller, very, very, very competitive focused tournaments. Like, for example, the other week we had the Legacy Showcase qualifier with like 26 players, and literally 13 on them were on Blue Red Delver. And that really shows like what are people willing to do when there's a ton of money on the line. Because even when you look back at like Legacy GPs where you had a couple thousand players, I would argue that of 2,000 players, like 1,000 something were just there to have a good time, which is like perfectly fine, right? That's why I travel to these things in the first place as well.
I think it's twofold. Like, back in the day, people weren't really incentivized to really break the format because the power level across all the decks was close enough that you could just play like some random tier 3 pile and just like do well consistently if you understood how your deck interacted with the format. But also when people did try and break the format, they often just misbuilt their decks, you know? Like, we were talking about how Ponder didn't, like, people just didn't understand why you would play Ponder in a control deck or anything outside of Delver and combo for years. And now people are just like, what, you're not playing, 8 cantrips? Like, if your blue deck doesn't start with 8 cantrips, what are you doing? That sort of dynamic. Yeah. So there's a bit of just like groupthink holding people back in terms of what was deemed acceptable deck building and how people explored ideas. And
yeah, one thing that also ties into that, I think that I feel pretty strongly about is that games used to last longer before Delver was printed. That's very much a noticeable effect. I don't have like empirical data on it, but it very much, like looking back at how Tempo versus the rest of the format fared back then, I think you got more turns.
This is when we played pre-Innistrad Legacy, this was a big takeaway. It was like the whole thing just chilled. Yeah. Okay,
that's cool. So I'm feeling a little bit more validated because now this is purely theory. But I really feel like back then, like from when I started playing until Delver was printed, the games lasted longer, like more turns, physically more turns. So you got to do more stuff. And even though your win, like back then, Rug Delver, that was like Canadian Threshold, the very classic list that had basically 73 out of 75 cards set in stone. Then you played Rushing River and Wipe Away. And when that was a thing, your win percentage against that deck, which probably was for most of the periods the best deck, was still not great. But you got to play Legacy. And I think a lot of people who are frustrated right now with feeling that their deck is not good enough anymore might have been living, I don't want to call it like being under an illusion, but just like the very fact that you get to play longer games, take more actions and stuff, felt more, I don't know, it felt good even though you lost. Whereas right now, if Murktide beats you into hits, it's fuck that shit, seriously. I hate that.
There is something to say about like Legacy Delver of yesteryear. Like Rug Delver, if you just like drew 3 removal spells and could cast them, which that was the hard part, right? Like Rug Delver back in the day was essentially just a Ponza deck. But if you drew 3 removal spells and could cast them, you just bought yourself a lot of time. Like that deck's game plan was just like, I can beat my opponent if they don't resolve spells. And then your opponent just like resolves a 2-drop and you're like, all right.
Yeah, to interrupt you there, like the big thing about that was like back then, unless you had Swords to Plowshares, there were not that many things that people actually played that would remove Tarmogoyf, and definitely not Nimble Mongoose, right? So those were the 8 threats, and there were decks that were decent in dealing with that shit, and that goes back to Veteran. Like Veteran Explorer back then was quite the thing, because you blocked Tarmogoyf, and then, you know, you could do something like, I don't know, drop a kitchen things, what have you. But while like with the tools we have right now, it would be really easy to remove all of these things. But Tarmogoyf was like one of those big things, because all of a sudden you couldn't lightning bolt it anymore. You maybe couldn't Gem Palm Incinerator it away anymore. Like it was quite the big deal, because it was annoying to try to interact with. But yeah, it certainly would like have big problems as soon as your opponent was able to play something like Genesis every single turn.
So you know about the player cycle graphics. I've mentioned them a few times in my articles because they keep being a relevant reference point in terms of different people play different games for different reasons. And Magic has some broad sweeping guidelines for demographics. There are the spikes, who are the hyper competitive people. There's the, you know, Johnnies, the people who want to get off some sick combo. There's the Timmies. And the way competitive Magic functions, or as you start to get more deeper into the nuance of the game, formats trend towards catering to spikes in terms of deck selection and gameplay. And if there was a hypothetical world where everyone's goal was just to win, every format would just be like 3 decks, right? Or it would just be, played a Legacy tournament and it was just nothing but Delver 100% of the field, or what have you. But because there are people who don't find the best deck fun, or might find something more interesting, or just have a pull to something else, you start to get diversity in their format just by nature of people wanting to have fun their way. And the whole illusion of choice thing is when the best decks get so good that you are forced to play them. We talked about briefly about like people picking up Delver, or like getting bored with their deck and playing Delver. Like one of the worst things about just deciding to try Delver is like that moment where you get it. That moment where you're just like, there's literally no reason to play anything else. Like you play like 10 games with Delver and you're just like I remember when I picked up Grixis Delver and I was winning, but there were just so many games I was winning because my opponents just were losing, if that makes sense. Like, they just were making plays that just didn't matter, and my deck was just beating them.
I always get the feeling when I pick up a Delver deck that's, like, really dominating right now, and I get to do all the broken sideboard stuff, right? When I get to, I don't know, Meltdown or what have you. It just feels really good. It just feels really, really good. And you don't always get that from the other decks. Like, yeah, you sometimes like completely destroy one of the decks with one of your like niche sideboard choices. But with Delver, it almost feels like there's a constant high of always feeling like your deck is better.
I agree. I agree. You should cut Meltdown. Yeah.
You're just like winning and you're not trying to win. And it's just this insane moment because then you go play something else and it's not that those decks are less fun now, or like, you know, the challenge of playing them is still there, but you're just like, good God, there's no reason to just touch anything but the Delver deck. And it's such a weird place to be.
Yeah.
Because it makes it like less fun to play the format.
I think that's the big point, right? I think a lot of people, and there's no shame in that, don't play the format, like you said, because they want to, like, I don't know, grind ticks, make it to the Pro Tour, whatever. And I think that's by far the biggest audience of the format. And when it's this obvious that Java is better than whatever else you could be doing, it's quite frustrating. And that ties back to what Callum Dye said about, like, it feels like before Java we had more turns to do something. And I think people were still enjoying themselves while Java was legal. Like,
shout out to Werebear, the original Thresh threat.
And Mystic Enforcer as well. Let's go.
Yeah, but I don't know. Like, when Top Miracles was legal, I still had fun picking up Shardless or Agrolome or just random other decks and still playing them. But with Delver being the best deck, maybe it's like a me thing. Like, maybe I just changed as a player, because Top Miracles was definitely as messed up as Delver has been. But I found it fun to just take a break and do other stuff. But, like, when I'm playing a lot of Delver, picking up other decks is just, like, unpalatable. Like, trying to play a control deck gets obnoxious. Partially because, like, Delver gets hard to combat, but also because control players hate losing to control players.
Yeah, that's such a big thing, right?
Yeah, it's obnoxious because what ends up happening is the control decks, there's like two metagames. There's like the actual metagame, and then there's the control player metagame. So you get people playing control decks that are metagamed against other control decks. Like, I cannot understand why people are playing for Narset. Like, I don't understand how people are, like, complaining about Delver Secrets decks being the best thing, and then all the control decks are just, like, 12 3-drops at sorcery speed.
Dude, you know, one day we should do an episode where we analyze the psychological biases in players of different decks, because I also really feel like there's nothing worse for control players to lose to another control player. They feel like almost like insulted.
What it is like, people saw Gil Wafatapa and they were like, oh, he seems really cool and smart and he plays control, so I'm gonna play control. And then, like, winning control mirrors makes you feel smart because, like, you know, nothing happens, and when the action happens in most control mirrors, or like when you are looking at the average game and cut out the extremes, most games kind of just come down to you outthinking your opponent, or at least thinking as such, right? Like, the top Miracles mirror was just game one, draw less white cards than your opponent. Literally,
it was like that was absolutely that. Yeah, it
was literally the deciding metric.
Yeah, game ones was so bad you could flip a coin and then move to sideboarding.
We got to a point where, like, if Anurag and I, or like Men, or like the other Miracles players got paired, I think at least back then you could, like, intentionally draw game one of a match to just go straight to postboard, and we would just play 3 postboard games.
Actually, that sounds a lot more exciting. Yeah, dude, I would be totally down for that.
Because game one of the mirror was a coin flip. Like, flipping a coin would just save you time.
Francis and I used to play mirrors in the pub, like, just to practice and stuff, and we never played game ones. It was just useless.
No, game one dynamics are just like, all right, so I played Counterbalance, or my opponent played it was like, Counterbalance would happen, and then somebody would put a Council's Judgment on the stack. If it resolved, the game would continue. If it got countered, the game would just end. Like,
yeah, it's kind of interesting in the sense that whenever something is or many times when something is broken that is not necessarily a combo deck, figuring out the mirror in these things is super interesting, right? We've seen it with when Luris was around, when top mirrors were around. Like, one of my I don't know whether it's like the most important Magic memories, but for example, when Top Miracles became a thing, I remember Mark Vogt and I visited his place, and we played just like Top Miracles Mirror for the entire time back then, when it was just like a new thing. And for example, I always ended up with Chase in play, and he always ended up with Counterbalance Top in play. And at that moment, I felt like, okay, I think Counterbalance Top is actually more important than like landing Chase. And it's just like working your way from there and figuring things out. That's something I absolutely love. On the other hand, of course, when something is broken, a lot of other decks suffer. And that's basically the whole dilemma that we're sitting at in Legacy right now again, where we try to figure out what are we supposed to do, not necessarily about this current build of Blue-Red Delver, but how do we shape or define the format identity so that people can understand what they will be getting out of the format in the future, so there will be less, feel-bads or surprises or pointless discussions about what should or should not happen, because I think a lot of time is wasted on that.
Near the end of Top Miracles, the Miracles chat was hilarious because we went from how do we beat XYZ decks to just having two conversations. How do we get 2% in the mirror and 2% in versus Delver? And then it just became how do we beat the mirror? It was just constantly every day just discussions of sick stuff you could do to other Delver or Miracles players.
To be fair, 18 or 19 lands went on for years.
Oh yeah. Yeah, how many spell snare?
Yeah.
Whether
well, that's Marcus.
Yeah, it's two. It's always two.
Yeah.
We kind of established what the format identity used to be for a lot of people in Legacy, a shared feeling of what you get out of the format. We kind of established why the current iteration of Delver is so annoying. I think most people agree. Lawrence already, you mainly pointed at expressive iteration, for example, allowing it to play much more of a mid-range game. And to me, it feels like Murktide is the big thing that also
every time Delver gets access to a card advantage engine, it becomes the best deck in the format.
That's a good
literally
way to
every
put it.
time.
That's a good way to put it.
Every ban. Look at the Legacy ban list, and you can just pick out cards that let Delver draw more cards.
Yeah.
And explosive iteration is going to get banned. It's not an if. It's going to.
And the second point being what I said about Murktide Regent, making it all the more apparent that you literally, the door is shut much more quickly. You don't get to play as much Magic anymore, and that creates another source of, huge frustration with what's going on.
I don't think banning Murktide matters. It's just a better Tombstalker that's, Tombstalker was good because it didn't die to Lightning Bolt, but could get killed by Swords to Plowshares. And Murktide's the same thing, but it's also weak to Red Blast.
Yeah, but not everybody gets to play Red Blast. That's
right.
the big thing, right? I feel a lot of decks that I would enjoy playing literally can't do what they want to be doing just because Murktide closes the game in 2 turns as opposed to 6 turns, and that's just such a big deal.
But I agree with that, but I also think that Murktide is much easier to manage when you aren't dealing with Delver constantly having pressure, right? Part of the play pattern with Tombstalker is that it would often come down pseudo late in the game. The Delver player would often be low on resources, and it would take a few turns to kill. But because the Delver decks that played it weren't really super aggressive, they were the bug lists that were more focused on card advantage engines or Hymn to Trock or whatever. So you had time to answer or top deck something. Whereas the blue-red based Delver lists, the early versions with Swiftspear were just aggressive decks. If you had a few removal spells, you could win. Now you need access to those removal spells, and you need to out-card draw them. And one thing about Explosive Iteration is that there's no deck that can use it better than Delver, because Delver can just play the best cheap effects proactively, and then you also can just play Bobble as a way to maximize the fact that it's not a classical divination and the fact that you're drawing 2 cards. You need to construct your deck with a low enough mana curve that you can cast Iteration plus something else or whatever you exile. And Delver's just going to be able to do that better than any of the control decks or probably Show and Tell. Yeah, I don't think Show and Tell necessarily wants this card, right? Even as a weird sideboard pivot.
Yeah, you mean expressive iteration and Show and Tell?
Yeah. I always
it's just too much mana, I think.
I find card advantages as soon as Show and Tell goes down the trying to draw 2 cards with 1 card thing, they just get so much worse. Like, even though the theory makes sense, like, it's like, oh yeah, so the way to fight these other control decks is just draw more cards and make them counter the things that don't matter. But it just never really plays out. Like,
you'd have to do a full sideboard pivot with like Dragon Reach Channeler, and it's just not worth it to devote like.
And then you have all these ancient
slots.
tombs in your deck that just like puke.
You know, that could be another episode, like which transformational sideboards in Legacy were actually ever really good, because that's a very small number of decks.
So I will say, when I had a fling with like Blue Green Omni, I did find I had a package, quote unquote, of Drawn from Dreams and Carpet of Flowers. I played 4 of both, and the carpets were like 4 on the sideboard, and Drawn from Dreams had 2 main deck, 2 sideboard, and that was good because that one, like the Delver decks with all the mana from Carpet, you could cast it through Spell Pierce and Flusters and stuff, and they actually had to like Red Blast or counter it, and then you get to resolve Show and Tell eventually. But generally, yeah, it was not great either.
So, how do we go about fixing this issue? Because in our next part in the show notes, I basically called it out. Like, if we just like keep banning stuff as it pops up, that's the broke approach. But what is like the woke approach? Like, what do we do so we can avoid the discussion of, oh, we should preserve this, but then we're gonna ban all the new stuff, or should we like redefine the format identity that giving the current printing policy legacy is? Like rotating. Is that the way forward?
As I see it, there's like major and minor bans. I've used different terminology for this, but like there are bans like banning Birthing Pod that fundamentally change the way a deck can be constructed or whether or not that deck can exist. And then there's stuff like banning Deathrite Shaman, right? Like every Deathrite Shaman deck is kept existing after that. And with Legacy, we've seen the Whac-A-Mole approach happen. And the issue with taking out a lot of the cards that would really fundamentally solve some of the gameplay issues of the format is that it would piss off a lot of people, right? Like, Wasteland's a heinous card and promotes really heinous gameplay. And there's definitely an argument for that card not being something that should be in the format from a just, like, promoting bad gameplay standpoint. But I don't think a lot of people would be happy about that. There's often discussions about, you know, should cantrips exist in the format or whatever. And the next step to that conversation is, doesn't banning fetch lands just solve a lot of the issues that people have with, like, Delver and control decks and the blue soup dynamic and cantrips being too good? But maybe people would or wouldn't like that format.
Yeah, honestly, I think banning fetch lands has always been like the big thing, right? Where we feel like it's the one thing that could fix a lot of things. I would think that banning fetch lands would actually create a bigger exodus out of the format than Brainstorm.
Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm talking about. That's the issue. It's like
it's almost like a prisoner dynamic in a way,
right? In order to like change the format to have quote unquote better gameplay, you're taking away a lot of the things that people romanticize about the format. So you have like this weird Sophie's Choice. So like, you know, do I necessarily want fetch lands to be banned from a personal standpoint? Not really. I'm ambivalent to the matter. From the standpoint of like, fetch lands make coverage terrible to watch, shuffle effects in general. They make mana bases too hyper consistent. So, like, imagine how you would build a Delver mana base without fetch lands, right? You'd have to actually consider how you build your mana base.
Spire Bluff Canal?
I mean...
No, probably not. No, you play 4 Volk, 4 Steam Vents, and go from there, but yeah.
Well, why would you play Steam Vents without the fetch ability, right?
Just for like, having an island that taps for red.
Oh,
with days.
Yeah. But you might also see other tech lands. You know, you might see some argument for, like, Barbarian's Ring being just like a random 2 of when you don't have fetch lands.
You're going full John Alexander now.
Oh, you know it.
But yeah.
Let's get the 1 of Counterspell in the
It'd almost be better to be going 3 colors at that point. Yeah.
Just because you have access to more dual lands.
Yeah. The price of the format was skyrocketed as well.
It's like, why are you playing extra colors? Oh, because it's better than like the other 2 color lands.
Yeah.
Right. Like the blue-red list is awkward because like Island Mountain is just a weird place to be. But yeah, exactly. It skyrockets the price of the format. So
I reckon you could ask like 50 Legacy players saying, would you go back in time and delete fetch lands? They'd say yes, and then very few would say they want them banned now.
I think most people who have an interest in understanding game design would just not want fetch lands to just exist in Magic. Fetch lands are innocuous, and it's the dynamic that I mentioned in one of my articles where I was talking about how, like, you print a random thing and it breaks something else. It's like dual lands are fine as a concept. Fetch lands are fine as a concept, like, in vacuums. But when you, like, put them in the same place, it becomes kind of bad gameplay.
Yeah, and there's so many cards on the ban list that are because of them as well. Like, where do you go from there if we went with this idea? Like, Deathrite and Delve cards are probably fine, and etc.
Yeah, anyway, my solution is that I would make I would do two things with Legacy. One,
I'll get spicy. I'm curious.
Oh, yeah. So the first thing is I would make, like, I wouldn't make an allegory to the Commander Advisor Guild. I don't think people who actively play a format should have that much power over what happens in the format, because it's like people are too close to the issue to actually not understand, but to set aside their biases, right? They might understand on some level, but there's still going to be a lot of bias that'll get in the way. But I do think, the input of these groups is important to understand at least how the player base thinks, in terms of making decisions. And the second thing is I would implement a suspended list in Legacy, and I would suspend days in Euro. I think if you just ban days, you might cause an exodus. But if you go, hey, we're going to give you 4 months just to see what Legacy looks like without days, see what you can come up with as, like, a Delver deck. If it ends up still being fine to play, if you still get to use all your cool Delver cards that you like, then sick. Days is gone. We'll just ban it or whatever. And if it ends up like the format is crumbling in, all right, we can bring it back with relatively little harm, right? Like having the knowledge that you might get this tool back means that people probably won't fire sell all of their cards. And the reason with Euro is essentially it's just like the best control win con, and as decks converge into like Bant or 4-color, they're always going to play Euro. And I would just nuke it so that the control decks are forced to
do something interesting.
Have different identities, right? Because like if you like nuke days and you have Euro in the format, it's just like obviously I'm just doing that.
Yeah, Euro is just way too good of days. Like the Euro decks, like just without like, days, it's too good.
Exactly. Yeah. Then it starts making sense to jam quad Narset, right?
Yeah. I would love to see this even as just an online thing. I like the idea a lot of testing things out. So whenever like I try and stay out of banned discourse, especially about days, because it always goes in circles, really. But my biggest thing personally is I don't have a personal attachment to the card, but I think the cost of banning it and then being banned forever, like I just think it's such a huge stabilizing part of the format. It's so like core to it. Think it could go so wrong, and it could be so bad, and then we don't get back to where we were, and we're like lost what we liked actually.
Yeah, and that's why I like the idea of a suspended list, because it gives you a chance to see do trial runs of bans.
Yeah, and Magic Online is the perfect place to do this. Like tons of people would play it.
Because I don't think anyone can really guess what Legacy would look like without days. Like if you mention random cards to me, I can tell you like how I think that card will play out, the effect it'll have on a format without testing it, and like usually be fairly accurate.
Yeah.
With the removal of days, that's just like not a change. I don't think we have like a real precedent for what Legacy would look like without people considering days.
I completely agree.
As a thing.
I think a lot of people think they have it worked out, but they just don't.
Yeah, I have no idea what that format would look like. I have rough ideas of like where I would start with Delver builds, but it's just a whole new world. Like people are going to have to relearn matchups. How they construct their decks is going to change based on days. How they play against other decks is going to change. Years ago, Todd Anderson wrote this article about Splinter Twin, and he brought up this concept of like perceived tempo or something like that, where essentially once you hit 3 mana with Twin, people were just too afraid to cast spells because what if they lose? So you just got to like keep mediocre hands and essentially just do nothing for like turns on end because your opponents were too afraid to play their cards. And I think dynamics like that have an effect on the player's psyche and how they interact not only with your deck, but potentially other decks in the format. And I think Legacy without days could be interesting. I worry, like, my hot take is that Daze isn't actually that insane against the combo decks of Legacy.
I think it's not very.
I totally
It's
agree
not
as
actually
well.
not a
No,
hot
no.
take. It's literally just like Show and Tell Daze is good against Show and Tell because they have enough wastelandable lands.
It's like a necessary little piece. It's like it's the combo decks is not good against them, but it says no, you are not going off on turn one on the draw. Like behave. It makes them play a bit fairer.
I like how it says like behave.
It's like because Daze exists, the combo decks can't go all in on just fully being Belcher.
Yeah. And
so they have to be built to be slower.
And the cards are there to do it. Like they're so powerful. But yeah, just like having to have this one extra mana floating, sometimes two. Like, I completely agree.
like
So I'm on the side of things where I'm like, I'd really rather keep Days in the format just because I really love the gameplay that it enables. But I've always hated the argument that people who are on the same side of the argument bring forward about, it's keeping combo in check. Like seriously, Days is not the thing that keeps combo. Like seriously,
Daze keeps Chalice the Void decks in check more than it does combo decks because those decks are always just super weak to Wasteland, and they often have like Ancient Tomb decks have high mana requirements, so Wasteland Daze just like brutalizes them. And then obviously it affects the control decks because they can't just like slam threats.
Yeah, I also like another one of my biggest things, especially in the last few years, we've seen, as you commented on earlier, the like quad Narset kind of decks and Teferis and stuff. With Days gone, I'm just not looking forward to play against the 4 Teferi, 4 Narset
that's
decks.
kind of like what I expect. Like we already talked about that we can't really predict it very well because it's just like too many moving pieces. But that is basically the reason why I'm also like on the side of I'd rather keep Days legal, but I'd love to see the idea of like suspending it. That I'm scared that people would be much more incentivized to tap out on turn 3 to do something and pass. Whereas right now it feels like you keep your mana open until the opponent's end of turn. Maybe you do something for 1 mana, for 2 mana, then you untap, play your 4th land, do your thing. And I like that more than people just like putting the 3rd land to play, tap out, do my thing, and yeah.
I think the thing is like Daze's text is good for the format in terms of speed control matters. It's the fact that like the alternative cost is essentially free. And, bouncing a land to your hand, and just being able to essentially like in a brainstorm deck, having a card in your hand, even if it's a land, is essentially 2-for-1ing your opponent because you can brainstorm it away and turn it into a spell, even though you're like behind on mana, which doesn't matter in your deck that doesn't care about getting past its 3rd land drop in most cases.
Yeah, Brainstorm Not So Secretly makes it like this hyper busted card because it also has a very, very like low ceiling, so late game it becomes dead very often. You just brainstorm it away, or the land, as you said.
Yeah, the way I've used it the most actually is when I played a lot of Blue Red Dive over the last couple of weeks is bouncing Misting Sanctuary, even when I knew I wouldn't be able to actually counter something. But sometimes, even just like denying a little bit of mana for the opponent is a thing. But the big thing is like getting the Mystic Sanctuary down to cast yet another expressive iteration.
I wonder if So right now where I'm at is like the free Force Spike is a good effect because of speed reasons or format velocity reasons, but the cost could maybe change. And I'm wondering what Legacy would look like if they like axed Days and printed a fixed version. Like instead of just picking up a land or picking up an island, what if you sacrificed an island, or like you could still pick up an island but had a clause where you couldn't play a land drop the next turn, right? So that way you cut off the angle of like Daze your thing, wasteland you. That might be too much of a drawback in terms of like completely losing a land drop, but that might be space to explore.
Yeah, it would be really interesting.
Just something I kind of like about like Daze is when you force them to Daze very early on, like quote unquote force them. I often find myself in situations where I feel like I kind of almost want them to Daze because it's going to delay the expressive duration so much because it's essentially a turn 3 play and not a turn 2 play.
This conversation is just making me love Daze. It's so interesting.
Daze is such a cool card to just think about.
Yeah.
But yeah, the dynamic of like knowing when to play into Daze because like trading your 2-drop as like a temporary sinkhole is more beneficial for you than the Delver opponent is also just like an interesting, gameplay dynamic. It's just Delver is just so good. So I don't know. I really wonder what a fixed Daze would look like. Well, for a while I thought getting rid of Delver would do that, but then like the printing of Dragon Rage Channeler and Ragavan showed that didn't matter. As long as there's just 1-drops that you can play that have like decent value, it doesn't matter if like you're playing Delver of Secrets explicitly. It's the Days Wasteland shell that matters more. It's like the linchpin.
I love the arguments like everyone will say, okay, well if you ban Delver, the actual card, it'll get better. And then as soon as Ragavan and Dragon Rage Channeler came out, they're like, look, they're not even playing Delver. I was like, yeah, because they got like 8 more 1-drops. But I think if Delver didn't have any good 1-drops, it's a hugely different deck, and
Yeah, but you can't ban every like playable red 1-drop, right?
So this is where like going back to the first thing we said, like broke is ban, 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 ban. Woke is adjusting or reaffirming the current format philosophy, and like maybe having high impact bans. Like I've sometimes thought recently, Ponder ban would be really interesting for the format, but I haven't delved too deep into it. I'm just kind of on the thing of just ban the stupid new cards. I don't really care, to be honest. I enjoy the play styles of Days, for example, as we're having this conversation. And there's not a ton of older things that I really want to fix, but I do want to fix the newer things. So I don't care if they keep banning things like Mishra's Workshop there, restricting Thorn of Amethyst is ridiculous in Unison. But I don't really care if they ban the newer cards and have to keep doing it.
It's I flip-flop on where I sit on that point, because what that really entails is banning every blue planeswalker that's splashable for 3 or less mana.
I just don't see it as that much of a cost. Like, get them out of here.
Well, okay, so like let's look at Oko. Whether or not you think Oko would get banned regardless, I think what really pushed that card to get axed was the presence of Delver using it. And like, say there isn't just this monstrosity.
It was Astrolabe as well, though.
Yeah, there was Astrolabe. What I was getting at is like, say you don't have to think about Delver being the issue, and you can focus on playing just against Oko in control mirrors or mid-range mirrors. You're afforded like different tools to combat the card, and you could argue that Oko would have either not have been banned or would have been around longer had it not been in a Delver environment. And that it might have been fun. I mean, I think there's a lot of people who actually do enjoy the Oko gameplay, and
there was some, but
like,
I think you're right. At the same time, though, what I'd counterpoint that with is, do you think Delver is healthy for Legacy if it's not too good? And
specifically,
I think it is
Delver of Secrets or the archetype of
the archetype.
aggro tempo.
Aggro tempo, not specifically Delver. I think Delver is maybe where the rest of the format had to keep up with Delver, the archetype, when the card was printed. But I think having a very highly interactive deck is good for the format. But there's actually,
I think aggro tempo is good for the format, but I don't like aggro tempo when it's also like can become the second best control deck after sideboarding. Right?
I completely agree, and this is where my ban the things when it gets too good. I know it's repetitive and I know it's exhausting for some players, and I can totally see the other side. But for me, I think having these cards to keep look, I mean, Legacy has some insanely busted combo decks, and that's really cool. I love playing combo these days, but I do think they do need to be kept in check to an extent. And Delver with the Dazes to say behave, the Wastelands and the Force of Wills and the Quick Clock is a healthy thing to have. But at the same time, I too totally agree that it's very, very easy for this deck to get too good, and we have seen it often, and it does get exhausting.
Yeah, Lawrence's idea of
decks
having like low impact and high impact bans, that's also basically something when people ask me, Julian, what do you want banned in Legacy? It's very often it's more like, I want like 1 or maybe 2 cards banned, or I want 7 cards banned. There's really not much in between. And for a long time, I was like the guy who wanted basically like Delver of Secrets banned, Griselbrand banned, Past in Flames banned, Terminus banned, like all these really high impact new things that are certainly like I call them high impact bans, or Lawrence called them that in the article as well.
I would actually consider those low impact because they're just deck specific bans or archetype specific bans.
Not so much. Like the idea behind that for me, is that I want to go back to where we have more turns. I mean that ties.
If you nuke all of those cards, you will fundamentally change the Legacy.
Yeah, that's what I want to do.
In a major way.
That's what I want to do. That's basically what I wanted to discuss in this part of the episode, where we figure out what is our identity for the format going forward. Because unless that idea gets implemented and solved, we will for the entirety of the continuation of the format ever have the discussion about, oh, should this be banned or should that be banned?
For me, it kind of comes down to the toss-up of, like, are we fixing days, banning days, or are we going to start actually looking at fetch lands to see what gameplay looks like? Because I think taking fetch lands out of the format also slows it down a bit. And cards like days... I mean, a lot of... The power of Delver is that it has all of these cards that are conditionally good and a really good filter engine in the form of, like, fetch lands plus cantrips. Cards like days trail off pretty poorly. Forces can be pretty mediocre draws, but, you know, legacy ban list discussion kind of gets into this weird circular spot of, like, cantrips.
That's the thing that I want to escape, right? That's the entire idea. That's what I want to escape. I think for
there's no escape. You can never run away.
Oh man! But for purely practical reasons, I think we can kind of rule out the idea of ever banning fetch lands, just because that.
Yeah, I think that would cause a large exodus from the format.
That. And also, I think Wizards really loves that people love fetch lands, so they can sell a lot of product, and they never ever want to really ban like fetch lands ever, because it's like when people say Chase is the face of Magic, I almost feel like selling fetch lands is the face of Magic to a degree, because everybody wants them.
I'd have to see sales reports have the presence of fetch lands in a set meaningfully increased.
I think it does very much, but yeah, that's.
I mean, I don't think cons sold. I guess cons might have sold a bit more because of the presence of fetch lands, but also that block had a lot of cards that defined modern, and I guess the Delve cards also defined legacy. I'd really have to see the numbers. I get where you're going for with that take, and I don't necessarily disagree, because I think cards like fetch lands do create a draw for people, but I also think that something like fetch lands are replaceable as something that would create a draw for people to buy a set, right? Because, like, if you disincentivize fetch lands being important, people will just pivot to caring about something else, and they'll just buy that in the same quantity as fetch lands.
Yeah, like, you're talking to the guy who wanted fetch lands bans for 10 years plus. Like, I hate those things for many different reasons. But I really think, like, I always just, like, see the big hype that's generated whenever there's, like, fetch lands and something, and when there's a new product and there's no fetch lands, everybody freaks out. And I think, like,
I personally just think that's a holdover from fetch lands being very scarce for years and then slowly getting more printings.
Isn't it a cycle that happens every single time? Like, they go up to like €50 or dollars, and then they get reprinted. They're like 20, and then over the next years they go up to 50 again. That keeps happening.
Yeah, I think people getting excited about fetch land reprints is mostly just because the demand or the supply is like being increased to meet the demand. And less so because people like the gameplay experience. I would argue that most people don't actually like.
Yeah, I totally agree.
Outside of Moto, like I hate playing with fetch lands outside of Moto.
Yeah, I just feel like Wizards probably loves the type that they can generate with those things so much that they would never even like consider it. Like I'm almost like trying to imagine how do we define the format identity without even. Or how we would do it if we were, for example, part of, I don't know, like a format committee or something that doesn't actually make changes, but more like makes recommendations to Legacy. And I'm trying to get to the point where we basically just say, like, what is our idea for Legacy? What is the identity for Legacy that we want for it going forward? And I think a big problem, to finish that thought, is a big problem is, like we lined out earlier, is that play what you want thing not being as prominent as it used to be. And I think that's the one thing that I would like to fix.
What if Days had an additional line of text that just said the next spell you play costs 1 more mana? That's pretty abysmal to keep track of in terms of like gameplay standards.
Yeah.
But like that does balance out the effect a bit more, right?
Or
it does. But I'm still not fully sold on like focusing so much on Days would really help all that much. Just because I feel like Days has the cost of bouncing a land is significant.
It's negligible. It is not significant.
I think it's quite significant.
It's really not that significant. It's significant in like certain situations, but on average, it's not significant enough to be a relevant drawback. And in a lot of situations, you know, against like Price of Progress or when you consider Brainstorm or whatever, picking up a land often can often be turned into like a beneficial
I don't know. Like, I feel like when I play something on the first turn and the other went like turn one, I don't know, Ponder, and they have to bounce their land, and oh my god, it feels like really good.
I think
Yeah,
turn 1 to
the
3 it's
turn-
pretty significant, and then after that
Yeah,
it's not.
afterwards,
Right.
like it's super annoying
Yeah.
when you get something dazed. That's where the great effect of it comes in, where it limits what people can really spend on mana.
Yeah.
And I'm always
And
like the
that's-
guy. I want people to have like less colors. I want people to play like cheaper spells, and that's why I like daze quite a bit.
I think you're right. If,
I mean-
if like Delver goes turn 1 Ponder and then the daze a spell, I am like jumping over the moon. If I get something dazed turn 5, I'm like, holy shit, I fucked up.
Yeah, and I think, I mean, there are interesting gameplay dynamics to the card, but I think that Delver just doesn't lose an insane number of games because it's dazing too early. And usually if you're casting a daze that early in the game, it's because you have to, or like it might be a newer player misevaluating a threat. Which is why I keep trying to think of like ways to balance the card, because it operates in an interesting space to me where any balancing effect, like daze is extremely potent, usually like turn 2 on after you have established some sort of board state, but then later on in the game its effect is negligible. And then adding detrimental costs to the card operate the same way. You know, the drawback of picking up a land or whatever is pretty low after turn 4. So adding a balancing effect that punishes basically the most broken daze draws. The turn 1 Delver, daze your Chalice, play another 1-drop. Now I don't have to care about anything for a while. Like those sort of plays.
Part of its power is having enough 1-drops to play on turn 1 as well. So right now we have Delver and Dragon Rage Channeler, and we also recently had Ragavan, of course. Back when like Team America was playing, well, like Glyphs and Tombstone because of the threats and Hymn to Turak and stuff, like, you know, there's a much more real cost when all your threats are 2-drops. So maybe that's a direction to look at as well.
Yeah, dazing yourself out of the game is really easy when your curve goes high, but
Yeah,
these decks don't have that high of a curve
absolutely.
anymore.
So going back, guys, how do we fix that issue? Is daze really like, or rather like suspending days? I would love to see. I love shakeups.
Julian,
I
if
think-
days was suspended would be pretty bad. They'd just see it coming.
Oh my god, that was like the worst counter spell ever.
Yeah, can you imagine?
But yeah, I mean, my thing is the suspended list gives people room to try out things, or at least like creating a Moto only environment where you can toy around with ban list ideas so that people could like play Legacy and then like Legacy without days as like parallel entities to get a direct comparison to see which thing they like the gameplay of more. Or like you could have a place where you could try things out. The whole issue with like tinkering with eternal formats is like the number of people entering Legacy probably isn't encompassing the number of people leaving Legacy. And the worry is like you have a subset of people who are not playing the format just because they hate the Delver gameplay, and who might come back if that is like removed as an issue. But if you take like the nuclear options, like, you know, mitigating fetch lands or whatever, you might see a large exodus of people from the format who will never come back. So like that's the issue. You're dealing with like trying to balance format health with player nostalgia, and player nostalgia tends to romanticize pretty terrible cards from a gameplay or like format health standpoint. So it's just like a rock and hard place situation. I don't think there is one singular answer to managing Legacy.
Yeah, I would even tend to nostalgia in this sense.
So for me, the very abstract answer, so that's not an ideal guideline because you would have to like work down from that to actually get to real decisions, is the abstract answer is make games last longer again. And that's just like why I have this idea of banning, well, either Dive of Sequence as well as a bunch of broken combo stuff that keeps a lot of other like non-blue decks in check. And
I don't think
where I would
banning
love to
stuff
go.
actually. So the issue with that is that it's twofold, right? Like there's the cards that are egregious, and then there's the fact that Wizards is printing more and more powerful effects. So like you could go, okay, Grizzlebrand plus, you know, the other cards you mentioned promote terribly fast gameplay, and you could remove them for the format, but then you could just have made a power vacuum for other effects to come in.
That's exactly what I want to do. I want to see those other effects. I want to see a different legacy then.
I think in terms of like format speed, you won't see an actual change, but you will see different gameplay dynamics. And I personally think that's fine. Like, that's cool with me. It's just, what does the player base want? And I don't, again,
yeah, I think
people are monolithic in their wants.
Yeah, I think
so.
the whole that there's a very problematic idea in a lot of ban discussions is where people are like, oh, that's not objective. That's just like what you think should happen. But I think we have to throw out the idea of, oh, we will do what the players want, because that's the ultimate gridlock. Nothing ever happens if we do what the players want, because you already mentioned, right, there's just like too many different ideas and approaches.
The issue is like, you can take that sort of philosophy and apply it to a format that is actively being supported by Wizards. You know, you can go, I don't care what the players want, when you're like balancing like standard or pioneer or modern, because you can just make your things, and if people want to get on the Pro Tour or whatever Wizards pro play scene looks like now, does it still exist? I think it kind of does. I think there was an update. I kind of just don't care. But you know, people are forced to play these formats because of the perceived like upside. It's like, you know, we've seen a lot of arena only formats fail because they just didn't funnel into anything, so players just didn't have a reason to touch them. And Legacy did have that. It was taken away, but there was still enough of a player base to keep it going. And because there isn't any tournament significance in like the grander scheme for the format, you really only have player wants and desires that you need to cater to / manage. So like, that's why part of why managing eternal formats is so hard, because you do actually have to think like, what do people want, and then you look at all of the conflicting answers. And
but the problem is when you basically shoot down the idea of implementing change because there might be people who don't want it, then you still made a decision. The decision is that it will forever stay the same, and plus all the new broken stuff. So
I definitely agree. Like, I don't disagree with your point. Like, I personally, the idea of like just nuking a bunch of decks in Legacy and just seeing what new archetypes pop up is interesting to me. I've played against Sneak and Show for however many years. I don't care to play against that deck. It's not that I dislike the existence of the deck or whatever. It's just that I've had this gameplay experience so many times that it's stopped being interesting to me. But there is like the flip side, right? Like, we've all played Legacy forever, but there's probably someone who's like new-ish to the format picking up the Blue-Red Delver deck and is having fun with it because it's a new gameplay experience. Like, remember when Treasure Cruise Delver popped up and everybody had fun with it for like 3 days? You know,
that's generous.
I was about to make the same joke.
It's, you know, it's like that deck popped up and everyone like had one good playtesting session. It was like, oh, that's really fun. And then they like went to a tournament and was like, oh.
But jokes aside, actually, right. Whenever like we have new players at our monthly events I run and stuff, whenever they're asking like, you know, what deck should I learn, and I ask them if they have preferences, like do they play modern and stuff, and if they don't have a strong preference, I very often tell them to play Delver, because I think it's the best deck for teaching you the format, for teaching you interactions, for getting better as a Magic player. It's decision rich. It is a super interesting deck. It just sometimes is too good.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah, I think the whole idea of being like sick of certain play patterns or like the speed of the format, it kind of like has created this thing, you know, where people started creating a lot of like sub formats or you know, like pre-Innistrad format, pre-modern, I guess middle school or something. Like all of those formats are. It feels like they exist based on the idea of we want games to be decided later on. We don't want to feel like we are already like dying on turn 2, even though it will still take like another 2 or 3 turns. Just like from what I see from playing them and from like what people tell me. And I think, Callum, you have more experience with that. You've dabbled more with those alternative formats that are like somewhat slowed down. The problem though, and I mean that's the core problem, is we can't really do that, right? Where we just take like quote unquote old Legacy and make that a new format, just because there's not enough people to really support that.
No.
Like when you split player bases, it always feels like horrible.
This is going to be the next point I make. Like when I like the idea of Lawrence's testing things out in Magic Online. I think Magic Online is the only place you should do it, because I think splitting an already fractured and at the moment quite angry player base about certain things, like should this or that get banned, blah blah, it's just getting this discourse going further. And like you're gonna, if we're gonna introduce these things on Magic Online or something, and I was playing some pre-initiated on Magic Online and like getting some leagues going and stuff, but I didn't want to go too deep, because then you'd get people who are saying like, oh no, this is actually the way to do it. And especially when you're like legitimizing it with suspended lists, like I do like the idea in theory. I'm just worried about splitting the player base even further.
Yeah, and that's the issue. It's like, we want to see new things in Legacy, but people aren't quite sure what change to make.
Mm-hmm.
And the worry is that there aren't enough people to like test out the changes. There isn't like a good avenue for testing out these changes without potentially just losing people forever.
Right. When Julian said like, what should we do? I was like, well, in my opinion, like I could tell you like 5 different routes to go to change things around, but I don't know what's best for the format, and I would like to see people play it for like 3 months to see. But we just don't have that access.
There's a number of changes that I would be fine with that I know a lot of people wouldn't be fine with. Like, I don't have a particular emotional attachment to anything, and I've played Legacy enough at this point that, like, any change is going to be... Any, like, major change is going to, like, pique my interest. But again, other people...
Yeah, I think that's one of the things of in Wizard's case, being in power of making these decisions, is that you... No matter whether you make a decision or you don't make a decision, there's probably like an equal amount of people who will hate you for either doing something or not doing something. And I think right now we're really like at a boiling point almost in the format where there's so much unhappiness about nothing happening. Where
I think the discontent is hitting like Sensei's Divining Top levels, right?
Yeah, that's a really good comparison.
But like Sensei's Divining Top was you can ban this and something else can come in, but it's not gonna like fundamentally change how people build their decks as a full 75, right? Like, people's game 1 presentations of decks were obviously metagamed a bit for Miracles, but they were more focused on like their intrinsic plan. Whereas with Delver being the best deck, as we were talking about, with Daze as a factor, it has like a rippling effect in deck construction just from the ground up. I think addressing Delver is going to be a more impactful thing than like getting rid of Miracles or Top, and that's, I guess, scary-ish.
I think some
scary is good. I like scary.
I think, well, as a format manager who's like trying to maintain a good relationship with the community, isn't that still like a terrifying prospect?
Yeah, it's like... somewhat terrifying, but from what I understand, they also don't really have this idea of like being really a format manager in that sense, because they are like quite vocal about that they don't really look into Legacy all that much. They like do it when the community gets angry and Anorak writes a letter and everything. That's like when they know something needs to happen. And I think that's also why they put this announcement in the January ban of Ragavan, that they said they are looking into further changes soon. And like the soon, like when is the soon gonna happen? Everybody, like, it feels like every Monday that rolls around.
Soon is a relative concept, right? Like,
yeah, but
in Legacy,
we're about to find out what it means for Wizards.
Soon could be 4 months,
They could have also decided it's not bannable, whatever it is.
Yeah, but even then, like, from a communications perspective, then you would at some point
hopefully
say how you feel about the format. I think from a format management perspective, like, you know how we always like clinch to any single bit of information we get from Wizards about how they think about Legacy, even if they don't change anything, just because it fills that void that we talked earlier about, where we don't really feel like what's the philosophy of Legacy anymore. Is this whole like play what you want thing really dying out, or are we gonna go back on it a little bit? But like, what's happening? We always feel like we're left alone. And I think from the Pauper perspective, I really love how much content they have put out about like explaining what they want to do with the format and what the gameplay experience should be like. And I don't expect them to make a video like they did for every single Pauper ban. For example, when Gavin Verhey made that video about the first wave of Pauper bans, that was amazing communication. That's basically something that could put away a lot of the build-up frustration right now, because people still feel that we're somewhat being neglected by Wizards.
I mean, that's why, like, the Pauper advisory group or whatever they called it
and I think there should be an allegory for Legacy. Just like, even if there are changes in a format, people just want to feel like they are being heard, or at least like their concerns are known, and having a community liaison could help with that, or could potentially help make it easier to disseminate certain changes. It's easier, like making a broad sweeping change to a format is rough, but like if you have like Anurag Das involved in the process, right, it's like easier to get people to like go for the idea if Anurag is the one like, yeah, we had a lot of conversations, we expressed our thoughts, we talked about it, and we thought like, hey, this would be the best thing, we told Wizards, they thought about it, whatever. But when it's just like Wizards nuking something, I think people get the perspective that like they don't care until they actually have to care, which who knows whether or not that's
a really good point. That's also what I wanted to express by the idea of Wizards really having to publish more thoughts about what the format identity of Legacy is right now, because without ever like speaking out about that, you can't ever make any like what you called high impact bans or changes, because people would be very, very, I don't know, they wouldn't really know what's going on in the format right now. Like, can we expect this every other like year now? Like, what's going on? Or is this like a huge pressure relief that's happening every 5 or 6 years? And if they actually had somebody to properly speak to us about this, dude, I'm dying to get that. I'd love to get that. Even if they would ban stuff that I don't want to see banned, I want the format identity to now really be defined, because previously we could really coast along by Legacy being what it felt like it's supposed to be, because there was nothing more powerful happening than before for quite a while. But I want to understand what the future of Legacy is from Wizards' perspective, and I think Wizards doesn't really like put in the resources to really put that together.
I would like to see just like a supplementary set built specifically to just like push the power level of everything but Delver, if that makes sense. Just like a non-blue booster shot, I guess.
Okay.
Because like, I brought up Vintage and how the best decks have had similar dominance to Delver, but like people either don't care about it, or you'll see like the Bazaar decks take different forms, right? Or like Workshops has a few different builds that provide different gameplays. Like the Golos Workshop and like the Ravager Workshops are two different gameplay experiences, but like Rug Delver and Bug Delver are not like two different gameplay experiences enough to really care. And I would be curious to see what would happen if we just like raise the power level of other things to get a bit closer to that of Delver, and whether or not people would enjoy that. Because like once you increase the power level of everything else, in theory it all balances out.
They made one perfect card for this recently as a saga.
I was going to say Endurance, right?
No, as a saga.
Oh, okay. Yeah, I'm on board with that.
Endurance is played in like the blue control decks a lot. I mean, it's still a good example. It's boosted other decks, but Saga is like, there was the Saga Van deck for a bit, but that's died off. Saga is the first card in a very, very long time that is like absurdly good in non-blue decks, and the blue decks haven't managed to play it next to Ponder and Brainstorm very well yet, and it's just great.
Yeah, and I think more cards like that would be good.
Yeah.
Like Urza Saga, when you just have like one new threat on the block, you get to have a lot of time. Players get a lot of time to figure out how to combat it. But if you have like Urza Saga plus like 4 other cards that were good in non-blue decks that raise the power level, and people have to spread their attention around more so, that kind of becomes a more interesting landscape to explore.
I agree. I'd love to see more stuff like this. It's a super hard card to like design, but the reward is there.
Yeah. I mean, I think it kind of starts at
Destroy all islands.
Destroy all islands.
If you have an island to play, you lose the game.
I was thinking having certain like restrictive costs or like additional restrictions. Like part of the reason the blue decks in Legacy are so obnoxious is because they can, like, all of the good effects are easily splashable.
I think the answer there is just double costs, like 1 white or whatever, 1 red.
I agree with the double costs, but you also start to run into some issues that like double costs are really hard to manage,
But you can also look at other drawbacks, like, you know, you can only cast this spell if you have some arbitrary prerequisite. I'm blanking on an example I could think of.
80 cards in your deck.
Yeah, 80 cards in your deck.
That's a real thing for, like, Delver's never going to touch Urian.
Right.
There was also like ideas like you need to control a basic forest because that's not something Delver will ever do, for example, to cast it. Like you don't need to have double green, you just need to control a basic forest to cast it. And then it's going to be like 1 and a green or something.
Exactly. Or like
I think
pretty much exactly that.
Well, I really like the way that Saga is like it rewards you for building your deck around a certain type, like artifacts, and you know,
and it does so without really
making you full
incentivizing the worst artifact gameplay,
Right.
which I think is cool.
Yeah, it's not like based around affinity, and it's a card that, like, yeah, a lot of people have said it's too good here and there, but I think it's the perfect power level for Legacy. But
Urza Saga exists in this like design space that's right in between like Dredge and actual Magic, right? Because it's really easy to interact with if you want to, but it also comes at an angle that certain decks either can't metagame for just based on how they have to be built, or like it's a big detriment to do so. And I think that's a good place to be.
yeah, completely
Yeah,
agree.
it's a really like great design, something great that came out of Wizards. So if I was gonna sum up what we talked about, I see 4 general ideas what could be going on in Legacy going forward. The first being basically like a big ban wave or something, like trying to significantly lower the power level in Legacy by like ripping off a band-aid and hopefully getting it to a point where like for the next 4 or 5 years we can survive at a power level that's not completely broken. The other idea that Lawrence brought up was the idea of, for example, having more surgical bans or rather like suspensions to see how those would play out. Callum mentioned that we could do that on Magic Online, for example. A third idea that I've heard is the idea of not errataing cards, but basically like printing fixed versions of them, because there's always this idea of power level errata, we don't do that anymore. For example, we ban days, but then we print a different version of days, like Lawrence pointed out. That's something that could happen. And the fourth idea is that we, or rather Wizards, actively prints cards that helps out the non-Delver or even like the non-blue decks. So we can create some kind of power balance there without actually cutting the power level of the format. So we see maybe even no bans, but still a feeling where people feel like, oh, we actually can play Magic again. Like you can do more of play what you want again without feeling like the game is gonna be over against Delver in a couple of turns. So I like that. And I like those ideas.
And I like the general part of the reason I want like a set or a supplementary thing where multiple things come into the format is because, you know, with Urza Saga, it popped up, but people figured out how to combat it fairly quickly because it was just the one new thing. Their attention wasn't diverted in any way. So just like drip feeding powerful effects in doesn't work because people figure out how to beat them and then they fall by the wayside. But if you have enough to make a meaningful impact, that could work, I believe.
So Callum, where are you? What are your hopes for Legacy going forward right now?
It is tough because I do feel like I'm at a point where I would like to do whatever would make the most people happy. And I think that is just the carry on.
So controversial, dude.
I know. I'm sorry. It's so boring, but like I think it's carrying on the Whac-A-Mole for a bit. Honestly, that's what I would slightly prefer.
They could also just be preemptive in their Whac-A-Mole, right? It's like a card like Renin 6, Oko, Explosive Iteration, whatever. You can look at those before they enter the format and go like, yeah, this is going to be a problem.
Yeah.
Because there's a huge precedent for certain types of effects.
Yeah.
And it might just be better to go like, yeah, we're just not going to subject you to Renin 6 Delver gameplay.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point because that's, I think, more socially acceptable almost, because if people never got to play with those cards in the first place, there's less of a feeling of, oh, but I enjoyed Oko so much or Renin 6 or something. Even though, of course, that also creates the other problem of where people are like, oh, dude, I wish I could play that in Legacy. But I mean, yeah, like Like we already established earlier, we're not gonna make everybody happy at the same time at all times. We're not chocolate.
Yeah, I'd also like. I mean, I think the Whac-A-Moling also helps Legacy be more separate from the other formats. Like, there was a quote I saw some time ago saying, like, like which format is this? Because it's just the expressive iteration format. It's played in every single format. Literally, currently, one of the best decks is playing expressive iteration, and like, yeah, like, so now you have Ren 6 and Ragavan in Modern, but not in Legacy, and it's diverse, it's different. But there was certainly periods in the last few years where Legacy and Modern have just felt very similar. And
yeah, since the printing of Euro, I keep looking at deck lists and I'm just like, which format?
Exactly.
Like,
so now,
like how, like before it was like, are there Shocklands in this mana base? And now it's like, is there just Wasteland, I guess?
Exactly. So now we have Uro in Legacy, we have Ren 6 and Ragavan in Modern. And like, I mean, if they have to ban Explosive Iteration and Murktide and Dragon Rage Channeler, whatever, to me, good riddance, honestly. But I know some people like Delver, but man, Delver's still going to be good. I promise you, even if all three of those cards got banned, Delver will still be very good.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, so...
You know what?
I don't mind if they're modern cards, like, because they're in Modern Horizons.
You know how Wizards used to have these Masters tournaments? That was like 15 years ago or something, like even longer, like beginning of 2000s, where they had an auction where you could bid on decks. So all the decks that had ever won a Pro Tour, everybody who had qualified for, I think it was the Invitational, you could bid starting life total or opening hand cards. So you could be like, oh, I really want to play the Academy deck, and I'm willing to go down to like 5 cards in my opening hand. And like the tiebreaker was, would you also be willing to go lower on life totals? So people like bid lower and lower. I would love to see a tournament where people like bid on, hey, how much can I cripple my Delver deck while still being like playable and good? Like, can we ban like Days and I don't know, Dragon Rage Channeler while still like playing the deck to a reasonable amount?
I think the only deck in the format that Delver wouldn't care about starting at like 10 life against is the Mirror, right? And like Bird, I guess. But like most other decks aren't combating your life or attacking your life total so aggressively that you're insanely worried on that front. And then you still have 3 to 4-ish life points to play around with for fetch lands and forces. Then you can probably take a hit from a random threat. Or the Delver decks can just, like, you know, pivot back to Young Pyromancer or something that just, like, has a moat style effect to slow down random aggression. But I think Delver could pretty aggressively, you know, be bid on up to a bit of a point.
Something you mentioned, by the way, Delver is always broken when there's like, you know, this mid-range aspect to it that's playable in it. For example, in this case, Expressive Iteration. I also feel like there's very often a chance that Delver is very broken when there's a playable main deck card that lets you exchange life for any kind of resource, right? Basically, like all the free spells that we can play in the main deck. Most importantly, something like Ataxian Probe that has broken it. So I'm also like feeling, please don't ever print something that lets Delver exchange life for anything really in the main deck, because that's not something that's happening right now. And you know, Wizards, they find ways to break stuff.
You're telling us to splash black for stuff out?
Like, it's really awkward as a format gets more powerful, free spells become more and more of a necessity to like allow people to keep up with the power level of the format. Like, think about Force of Negation entering Modern, right? Like, that was hugely beneficial for like the controlled decks because they were getting to a point where they were getting outpaced by the the combo decks.
I think Endurance as well. People have I haven't played a lot of Modern, but people have said the same about Endurance recently as well.
Right. But then the issue is like, how do you build a free spell that isn't going to become like really exploitable? Like, I think Endurance is a good place because it has such a specific design or like such a specific thing that it's targeting, right? Like Force of Will just hits anything.
Endurance is so healthy for Legacy, I think. Well,
yeah.
I hate that it like really killed off Dredge and Hogak. I enjoyed those decks, and they weren't like too good and quite easy to hit out, but it's just very good against Delver. I
think Dredge and Hogak are like negative gameplay experiences for enough players that I'm fine seeing them go.
Yeah.
But I agree that like seeing specifically those decks kind of get nuked out of the format is weird.
Mm-hmm. It's splash damage and it wasn't intended. It's just one of these things. Yeah. But who knew a non-blue 3/4 flash with reach, just really good.
Cool. Yeah. Guys, so I think we did a pretty good summary of like what the issue is right now. We presented a couple of options how we could fix that. Of course, like we have no idea what's gonna go on. Maybe next Monday rolls around and they're gonna actually ban fetch lands soon. I don't know. I think there's this general idea.
It's never gonna happen.
Yeah, sure. I know.
Never, like, that's the whole thing about, like, it's the nuclear option, and it's never gonna happen. It's just fun to think about because the construction of every deck changes, and the way you approach deck building becomes a lot more deliberate, which interests me at least.
Yeah. I think like that's why I'm at the core. I'm an extended player. That was my first format I ever got into. I like when there's huge shakeups, but I don't want them to occur all that often. I want them to be around for like every couple of years, and that excites me. And yeah, I guess that explains my whole approach to the format right now. That's why I'd be super happy to see like a huge ban wave. But we will see what Wizards is going to do. I don't expect it to happen, honestly.
Yeah, I mean, I'm personally fine with like weird stuff happening to Legacy. My frustration comes in when it's getting disproportionately abused by one deck. Like, I'm fine with like random cards being printed that just break Legacy or like warp the format. Wrenn and 6 got miserable pretty quickly, but it was fun. Astrolabe, people didn't build those decks that well initially, and things that arbitrate mana in Legacy in Magic tend to just be disproportionately powerful, so that card was a mess, but it was like kind of interesting for a hot second. And there are other examples. I'm kind of fine with format like Legacy getting warped and then returning to its status quo, but we've just seen some disproportionate warping more towards just Delver getting better and better, and then control decks inbreeding, which I do wonder what the control decks would look like if there wasn't that pool to inbreed, and how much or how dominant Delver would be if these decks had a little more like space to actually try and combat it, as opposed to, again, quad Narset. Why are we doing this? Why are we playing quad Narset and then complaining about days?
Cool. Guys, I think we're going to wrap it up here. If you want to support the podcast, you can do so by leaving a review on Apple Podcasts or support us on patreon.com/everydayjournal. Lawrence, where can people find you? Where can people read more about you? Do you stream? Do you do other podcasts? Where can people find you?
Right now, it's just Channel Fireball. I haven't really been using social media or doing other projects, so yeah, that's where you can find me, channelfireball.com. I guess I will be tweeting when my articles go live, so twitter.com/LAWR Harmon. Other than that, I've just been kind of laying low.
Awesome. Cool. And Callum, where can people find you, other than on mountaintops in Italy and being miserable in London?
If only, or the former. At Callum Smith MTG on Twitter is the best place.
Awesome. And you can find me on @itsjulian23 on Twitter. And if you want to follow the podcast, that's @EternalMTG on Twitter and Instagram. Hey, we got the same handle, like finally, same handles for thing everywhere. Also, big shout outs to the supporters that allow us to run this podcast, especially our Eternal Witness tier supporters, Tommy Hinks, Testacular, Sebastian Holager, Guillaume, Jake, Hanawar Elf, and Severin Schwarzhuber. And our Grizzlebrand tier supporters, Victor Bernatz, Baju Butt, Scott Monroe, Jeremy Gates, Henry Corkutz, Tom Happ, and Paragon Games in St. Louis. Hope you're all having a great time. Hope you're all getting to enjoy Legacy, maybe even more in the future again. And see you again next time when actually we're going to have a pretty big announcement, Callum, right? Mm-hmm. We can't tease it yet, but that's going to be a pretty big thing coming up.
I'm very excited for it. Super, super excited.
Awesome. Yeah,
I'm
super excited.
It's even better than Moonboating Bears. Sorry, Moonboating Bears.
Oh, wow, the disrespect, man.
Not to the person, just doing the act of Moonboating Bears.
I've never seen moonboating bears.
Oh boy, you haven't lived.
Yeah, apparently. Cool. Everybody, thank you, and see you again next time. Bye-bye.
Goodbye, everyone.
See ya.